Welcome to the Arabesque Sewing Studio and to video 2 of the Sewing Space Station tutorial series. Now if you missed the first video where I went over the introduction to this amazing mat, you can go back and watch video 1. In video 2 we'll be covering how to prepare your templates, how to cut everything out, how to prepare your binding, and how to quilt all the panels that you'll be needing for the space station. So go ahead and print out your pattern. And of course you don't need to print out the whole pattern, you can just print out the templates at the end of the pattern. And the very next thing that you need to do is check that your scale square is accurate. And this is really important to make sure that all of the pieces have printed at the right size. So the way that you measure your scale square is you're going to put a ruler directly over that box here. And you don't want to be seeing any of those sides of the box. So you don't want to see them at all. You don't want them to be larger or smaller. So when that is hidden directly under, I can't see exactly without getting right on top of it, but that should be exactly a 1-inch scale square, and that's going to mean that everything here is exactly the right size. So then you're going to want to go ahead and cut all of this out. And remember that the more accurately that you cut, the better that your pieces are going to turn out, because every time that you make a little mistake or just cut something just a little bit wrong, it will be amplified in the next step. So you're going to want to cut your pieces up into smaller pieces. So this just makes it much easier if you don't have any drag of a larger piece, just pulling off and putting some weight over that other side. Just cut everything up into small pieces and then cut them out just outside that line so you can still see that black line. Now the template for the front tool panel needs to be joined together. So you'll see here written across the bottom of your part A, it says join to part B, and on part B it says join to part A. So there's 2 sets of arrows here that we're going to align, and then you're just going to put a couple of bits of tape there just to hold them together. And now that's the right size to be ready to trace onto your quilted panel when we have finished that. So here we have all the pieces for the sewing space station laid out. So if you follow along on your cutting chart, you'll see all of this laid out for you, and you can go across as you cut everything and just tick everything off so that you can make sure you've got the correct number of fabric pieces cut, lining, interfacing and fleece, and you can make sure that you haven't forgotten anything. And I can just see here that I have missed one piece of interfacing for my inner tool pocket here, so I have to go back and cut that again. And I'll just run through the pieces quickly for you. So for the front tool panel, so this is the part that hangs down at the front of the machine, the outer tool pocket and the cargo bay, front and flap. These are all going to be made from panels that we quilt, and then after we've quilted them we will be placing the template onto that and cutting that out. So you'll notice on the cutting chart that all the pieces here are actually larger than you need them to be. So you can go in and just work out whether you agree with my measurements here. So for this one I have actually cut this even larger because I'm going to play around with the placement of where I put this outer tool pocket after I've quilted the panel. I want to be able to just have a little bit of choice to move this around so that I can work out which part of the motif I would like to feature on this pocket. So you can decide to perhaps quilt a larger piece, or if you just are quite happy with having quite a small amount left around the template, you can cut things a little bit smaller and maybe save a little bit of fabric. So the next part that I'll be doing is quilting the top pocket panel and the base. So you need to go ahead and make a quilt sandwich out of this. So this means that you'll be fusing the fleece to either the top or the bottom fabric, doesn't really matter. And then because my fleece is only fusible on one side, I'm going to be spray basting this to the other piece of the fabric. So that means I'll be putting down an old towel on my ironing board, and then I'll just be spraying just enough basting spray to get the other side to stick enough so that I'm happy that it's not going to move as I quilt it. So I'll be doing that for all of my pieces that I need to quilt. I'll be spraying some basting spray on the back of the fusible fleece just to make sure that that's going to stay in place. So I'm just going to run through how I make my bias binding for this fabric. So if you're not familiar with bias binding, on your fabric you've always got a selvage here, which is the side that they weave the fabric from, and you'll have two selvages if you have the full width of your fabric. And on the 45-degree line between the two selvages is the bias of the fabric, and if you pull it along here you'll see that there is a lot of stretch, and if you pull it this way there's a lot less stretch. If you pull it top to bottom there's very little stretch at all. So just try that out on your fabric and you'll see what the difference is. So bias binding is awesome because it just molds around curves and gives you a really snug look if you're trying to bind something that's not just a straight edge. So it does take a little bit of extra practice to master this, but once you're familiar with bias binding you're going to love it. And you can purchase this as a pre-made packet, but you just have a whole world of possibilities if you learn to make your own. You can use whatever fabric you like and get a really beautiful finish. So when we cut this, I just like to trim off my selvage here and get a nice straight edge. So I'm going to be cutting this on the 45 degrees, but I don't want my stripes to go along the length of the binding. I'd like them to go that way, so that we'll end up with a nice stripy, short stripy edge rather than a long stripe, which is going to look quite odd. So on my ruler here I have a 45-degree line, and that's what I'm going to line up along the bottom of my fabric here. So I'm just going to pick a spot and put that along the bottom here, parallel with this bottom edge, and you can see that this edge here is now on the 45 degrees. So then I'm just going to slice my way up here. Now my ruler will not be long enough, but that's okay. You can just move it out just a little bit and realign that, and then you can just finish cutting your line along there. So now you end up with two nice straight edges, and this is what you're going to cut the rest of your strips of binding based on both of these edges. So I'm only going to use a fat quarter here, and I will be able to get all the binding that I need for the pattern here. So I have given you a little bit more in the pattern, and that's just in case you would like to use any of that for decorating any other portions of your pattern. So you're just going to slice this up into the width that the pattern calls for. And if you would like to see a really in-depth video of how I make this, you can head to my video for the Smart Sofa Station, where I show you an in-depth look at binding for that. But I will be going into more detail about how we bind those tricky internal curves. So if you're worried about them, I'll be giving you all my special tips. So I'm going to show you how to join the strips together that you've just cut out. So you're going to take two strips and place them end to end. And what you want is to have one of the ends going the same direction as the other end. So you don't want them both pointing at each other. You want them both pointing that way at each other. And the way that I'm going to sew these together is you're going to take the right hand side and flip it so that these are wrong sides together, parallel with these two edges, and you're going to want to just overlap them enough so that you'll see there's an intersection at the top here and an intersection at the bottom here, and then we're going to stitch from that join there down to there where they cross there. So that's going to be how we join them, and then when we open this out, this will make one continuous line of binding. So for this particular one today, I would like to get all my stripes lining up. So I'll just show you how I do that here. So I'm going to take the top one and just fold under a little bit here. I'm doing just about 1 centimetre or so. Just makes it a bit easier if you just do it a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch. And then you're just going to slide that back over onto here. And you want these top edges and bottom edges aligned here. So make sure that you've actually got enough. You're going to have a seam allowance underneath. And then I'm going to take my trusty glue here. And I'm just going to put a few dots of glue along here. Doesn't have to be much at all. Then I'm just going to move this around until I can see I've got my stripes lining up as closely as they can. I'll just give that a good push down. So then you can open that out just the way that I showed you at the beginning, and you're going to stitch from that junction down to that junction, and hopefully that will give you a nicely aligned join there where your stripes are all joining nicely. Now to construct your front pocket panel, before we can quilt it, you're going to lay them right sides together, and we're actually going to sew a seam along this long edge before we fuse everything. So if you've got a directional fabric on your top fabric, you're going to want to think about which side you want to sew your seam on, because the seam is going to end up at the very front of the mat. So if you would like everything to be up the right way, you're going to sew your seam at the bottom of the fabric. And if you don't have directional fabric, just pick any of the long sides. So we're going to lay these right sides together. Just ignore this seam here. I've had to join a bit of fabric together for my lining here. So we're going to sew these together along one of the long sides at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now I've sewn this seam on the top pocket panel, and I have fused my fleece up to that stitching line. So that's just up to the stitching line. And then you can fold the lining back and make a sandwich out of that, and just give that a really good press along that edge there, just to keep that nice and crisp and get that seam line right on the edge there. And then I'm going to baste this down onto the fleece with my basting spray. So now I've got all the pieces here that I have fused to the fleece, and I have basted to the other side. So these are now ready for quilting, and you've got a range of options here. You can always take this to a long arm quilter and have a pantograph stitched on the top of that if you would like to do it that way. You certainly have a lot of a larger range of patterns to choose from there. I don't typically have access to a long arm quilter easily, but it's something I might do one day. So in the meantime, I usually just like to use a very minimal either straight line quilting or a grid, and I rule lines or I score them with my hero marker along with my ruler, and you can also use a guide on your sewing machine to follow your previous line of stitching if you like. And So I'll probably be quilting this at a 1.5 inch wide grid, and I'm going to do the base in a 1/2 inch straight line quilting. So if you're confident in your straight line quilting, and if you aren't when you start this, you should be when you're done, because you'll have plenty of practice. You can choose a thread that is going to blend in if you really don't want it to stand out. Otherwise, you can go to town and choose a really pretty thread that's just going to make this pop. And I also recommend you use quite a long stitch length just to help the stitches really stand out. So I like to set mine to about 3.5 long on the stitch length. And yes, just bear in mind that with the base, both sides are going to be showing. So whatever you have on the top, make sure that you're happy with the thread colour that you've got in your bobbin. So I'll see you on the other side. I will show some of the quilting that I'm doing and give you an idea of how it's looking. I'm quilting this top pocket panel here, and when I'm doing that, I'm actually starting from this finished edge that I have here on this seam. So doing that's going to avoid any of the potential shifting and bunching that you might have from your fabric layers moving, which could happen if you start at the other side and stitch towards this edge. So make sure when you're doing this that you start at this finished edge and you stitch towards the other side, and that's going to ensure that all of your layers stay nice and together and this edge stays nice and neat. And when we're done, I'm going to be burying all my ends here so that everything stays nice and neat. Here I've got the top pocket panel and the base piece is quilted, and can I just say, how good does this look? Now if you have put in all the work and quilted your panels, you've got some beautiful squishy panels here now, and you can pat yourself on the back from all that work because it just looks gorgeous. So we're going to cut these down now. So you just grab your rotary cutter and your ruler, and you're going to follow the measurements on the pattern here. And you're just going to cut this base down on all the sides. So this is perfectly okay to use the measurements on the grid of your cutting mat here. So if you've come from a quilting background, you've probably been told not to use your cutting mat for measurements for cutting things, and that's true if you're going to be cutting quilt blocks. Say you're going to be squaring something up, this won't be probably as accurate as you need it to be if you're going to be sewing quilting blocks. But if you're cutting out a large panel, you generally won't have a ruler that will be big enough for this kind of thing, and so it's perfectly okay to use the measurements on the mat. That will be completely okay and certainly accurate enough for what you need. So now you need to take your corner template, and we're actually going to place this onto the top right corner here. I like to leave just a fraction of a gap on on each side just to allow for the thickness of the pen. And I'm going to just trace that around that corner. Up to there, and we're also going to trace the bottom left corner. Now, before I cut this, I'm going to take this to the sewing machine, and I'm just going to baste just inside both of these marked lines, just to lock all those layers together. And then after that, I'm going to trim off this corner along that curve that we've just traced. Now we're going to trim the top pocket panel. So you'll notice here that we have a finished edge here where we've already sewn the seam. We're going to trim this down, but we don't want to be trimming this finished edge. So you're going to go ahead and cut this down according to the measurements on the panel. And just have a look at the back and just check that everything's nice and neat on there, and that's all looking really good. Now these are both stitched, and I'm just going to trim along this line. And repeat this for the opposite corner. So I've just laid out all my quilted panels here, and I actually haven't quilted the panels for the cargo bay yet, so I'm just going to put these aside and show you how I'm going to quilt these in a later video. Okay, so it's a good idea just to lay out what you've already got. This is sort of like a last minute check for if you're happy with the fabrics that you've chosen. You'll be able to see a little bit better just how it's all going to come together. So I just think this is looking really gorgeous. I love this combination together, especially when you see the denim with the white stitching on the back. And wouldn't that just look gorgeous with some extra big stitch hand quilting? Anyway, so I've got my base, I've got my top pocket panel. This is the tilde panel for the outer tool pocket, and this is the front tool panel. So this is also with the denim on the back. So you can just see all that together, and it's looking really good. So I'm just going to set the base aside, and these two panels, we're just going to be focusing on this top pocket panel and binding this. So you're going to want to take your top pocket panel and the length of binding that it specifies in the pattern, and if you've got any of these diagonal joins or ends here, just going to trim that off just right on the edge of that where it begins to divide, just so that you've got a nice straight edge to start with. And you need some of your binding clips. Now I like to do a bit of a dry run with my binding when I'm laying this out, so I do have some joins in my strip here. And what we want to make sure is that this join is not going to be ending up on a corner, because that's just going to make that mitered corner quite bulky and hard to turn under, and hard to make nice and flat. So when you lay it out, you just want to make sure that this join probably isn't within about 2 or 3 inches of this side or this side, because it's going to just get pulled up into that when you fold that mitered corner in. So if it's more than that away, you've got enough clearance for that, and you don't have to worry about it. And when I'm binding, I like to decide how I'm going to edge my binding. So I like to sometimes hand stitch my binding down at the end. Sometimes I like to top stitch it, but I like to have that invisible so that the stitching will actually be on the back. And sometimes I like to have my top stitching showing on the front. And so all of those choices are going to affect the side that I start on. and this really is just up to you. You might have a preference where you like to sew it on the right side first and then finish it on the back, or you might like to sew it on the wrong side first and then finish it on the front. So today I'm going to be demonstrating sewing this onto the front and then gluing it onto the back and top stitching it on the front. And this is just the way that I've picked for this particular project, so you are welcome to go ahead and do it your own way. So make sure that you have your pocket oriented the right way. So we have the finished edge where we have the sewn seam here at the bottom, you have the raw edge here on your left, and two raw edges at the top and another one on the right. So we're going to be starting on this top right hand corner, and I like to just overhang my binding just a little bit just to make sure I've got enough there, and I'm going to just clip that across here. Okay, so we're going to stitch all the way along here, and when we reach about 1/4 inch away from this top right hand corner, we're going to stop and we're going to back stitch. So now you've got this first edge stitched, and if your binding is a little bit wavy like this, you don't need to worry about it. You can just give it a press with the iron, and the magic of bias binding is that it will all just press flat again. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to turn this corner here. So we've stopped stitching 1/4 inch away from this end here. Now we're going to fold this up at a 45-degree angle, then we're going to fold it back down. We're going to line up that fold exactly with this top edge here, and this edge is going to be parallel with this right hand edge here. So I'm going to put a clip on that, and then I'm going to keep clipping down this side. Now what you'll be finding is that this bias will be stretching and shifting just a little bit as you sew along. So you just let it do that. Don't worry too much about that, because this is the nature of bias. It's going to move a little bit. And the more that you sew this, the more that you'll just get used to the way that it handles. So when we reach this end here, we don't want to have a raw end here on the end of this top pocket panel. So I'm going to just trim this off, and I'm going to leave probably about just over 1/4 inch here. Now this is likely going to shift down a little bit longer and lengthen as we come down the seam here, but that's okay. You're going to readjust it. What we're going to do is fold this up, and the other option you have is folding it under and catching it from underneath as you go down. And this is just going to hide all of this raw edge when we turn it back. So this particular time I'm going to stitch this underneath. So I'm just going to fold that back and under level with this sewn edge that we already have here, and keeping this all level here. Just going to put a clip on that. Okay, so now we can take this to the machine. We're going to sew down this edge with 1/4 inch seam allowance, making sure that we back stitch here and at the bottom as well. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and give this a press. And you can see now that this binding has gone down nice and flat, and I'm really happy with that. So now I'm going to flip this the other way and give this a press on the right side first. And this just enables you to help ensure that your seam line is going to be nice and even, because sometimes if you don't press this edge of your binding, it can just bubble a little bit inwards a bit more, and then when you flip it back the other way, you just end up with a bit more of a wavy edge, and sometimes you won't catch this back edge if you're planning on top stitching it with the sewing machine. Now just having a look here at this end here, just to remove a little bit of the bulk on this edge here, because we're going to have a bit of a bulky join here. I'm just going to trim just a little bit of that corner off, and that's just going to help reduce some of that bulk. So now I'm just going to pull this round and outwards, and I'm going to give this little bit of the seam a press here, and I'm also going to just tuck it slightly, just make sure that none of that is going to stick out below the edge of this sewn seam here. So you just mold your binding, and that's what the beauty of bias is that it actually will stretch and shrink just where you press it. So I love it. Now we're going to flip this to the other side, and depending on the side that you flip this to, this might be your right side now, this might be your wrong side, but I'm going to turn this back over to the other side. Now the aim of this is that you want to be covering this stitching line, you don't want to be seeing it. So when you flip it, all you need to be doing is just making sure that you can't see this stitching line, and make sure that this edge here is covered by, is all sort of hidden up inside there, so there's no raw edges showing, and also that this end here is not sticking out below that. So then I will give this a press. Now as I approach this top corner here, I'm just going to pull this out, make sure that this is nice and neat. You want a nice mitered edge here, so just give that a careful press. And then I'm going to fold this end under, and what you want to see, even though this is going to be hidden for me, it might not be hidden for you depending on whether this is your right side, you want to see that mitre here ending exactly on the corner. And so if it's not, you can just manipulate this a little bit more, pull it and push it until you see it going exactly where you want it to end up. So if it doesn't meet properly the first time, open it out and just fold it again until you get it exactly where you would like it. So then just go right ahead and keep going to flip this round. Now the next part is up to you. You can go ahead and clip this in place now to hold all of this down. Now I'm actually going to be top stitching this, and I think this time I've got enough overhang here that I could top stitch in the ditch here, so that the stitching will be seen on the reverse, but you won't see it on the front, so it will be hidden in the ditch. Now you can also top stitch along the top of the binding if you would like that look as well, or you can hand stitch this down on the back. But my preferred method for doing this is to glue along my binding down, and I've been doing this for several years now just to hold this in place. So I'm just doing a lovely narrow line of glue here. You don't need to do heaps at a time. So now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch this down in the ditch, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how it looks from the other side. Okay, so here I've got all the binding stitched down, and can we just say how pretty does this look with this stripy binding? It just really pops. I love it. So let's just have a look on the back here. So you can see here this has turned out pretty well. You've even got a little bit more play that you could have perhaps stitched with a slightly larger 1/4 inch seam here and still have had it turn out really nice on the back here. And you can see on the front here, you can't see my stitching line because it's hidden in the ditch here. So this is just a different way of getting a look that looks like you've stitched it, hand stitched it down, and when in fact you've done the speedy version where you didn't. So now we're ready to sew the top pocket panel to the base, and we'll be sewing the pockets into the base. So you want to make sure you've got your base with the top side facing up, and these corners, these rounded corners, are going to be on the top right and the bottom left. And you're going to take your top pocket panel and you're going to make sure that your finished edge is facing you here, and that your 2 bound edges are on the right hand side, and on the top you have a raw edge here on the left hand side. So you're going to align this raw edge here on the left with the raw edge of the mat on the left here. And that's going to mean you've got just a little tiny corner sticking out here, so that needs to be there. We're going to trim that off later. So then you're going to just measure and check that you've got about 1 inch on all of your clearances here. So this is going to be, can't measure this very well. If you've got a little bit more at one side, just shift it down a little bit. You're aiming for about 1 inch all around. And we're just going to grab some pins, and we're just going to pin these together. And you don't need heaps of pins here. I'm just going to put about 3 along this edge. And make sure when you're pinning that you're not bunching up anything underneath. So you still want this to be sitting as flat as possible, and you're not shifting any layers as you pin them together. Then I'm just going to pin along this bottom edge here. And then just flip it around, and then just keep pinning up this side. Just keep checking that you're not shifting anything. Already got pinned up. So another few just up here. And then finally just a few along the top here. Okay, so let's just turn this back so the mat is facing the right orientation again. We're ready to mark the position for the pocket sections here. So the very first thing you're going to measure is, starting on this left hand edge, line the edge of your ruler up with this edge here, and we're going to measure from this left hand edge 7 3/4 inches across, and place a mark. Then you're going to measure a further 1/4 inch, place another mark, and you're going to measure 9 inches, so that's going to take you to 17 here, then another 1/4 inch, and then the remaining edge that you have here should take you, this should measure 5 3/4 inches here. So go ahead and measure again across the bottom, so you mark these same measurements here. And then I'm going to rule from the corresponding marks here, just join these up. And this is going to be your stitching line. Now the last measurement that we need is to mark this little pocket in here. I'll just grab my smaller ruler for this. So this is going to measure 4.5 inches up from this finished edge here. So just rule that from this edge of this binding, just make your ruler straight across there, and we're going to rule from this last line that we ruled here across here, and this is going to stitch this pocket into this section. So now we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and the first seam that we're going to sew is we're going to top stitch along this bottom finished edge here, and then we're going to baste up this left hand side here, and this stitching is not going to show, this is going to be hidden under the binding later. Then you're going to stitch these 2 lines here and these 2 lines here, and finally we're going to stitch this channel in here, and the very last one is going to be from this top edge of the stitching line here all the way up to the corner, and we're going to sew that right along that edge of that binding, about 1/8 of an inch away from that, and that is going to form the last pocket that you can put notions into, or even the cargo bay will fit in there if you wish. So now we've sewn the channels into the pocket, and the pocket is attached to the base. So you can see here that I've left all my tails long, and if you would just like to make sure that you don't have any of these ends come unravelled, you can just pull on the bobbin thread or on the top thread, depends on which way you want to bury them, and using your self-threading needle you can tie these off and then bury that inside. That's going to safely lock everything in, keep all your ends neat, you won't be able to see them becoming loose and unravelling. So I'm going to go ahead and bury all of my ends, and this will just keep it looking super nice on the other side as well. And so when you've done that, we're going to set this base aside, and we'll be sewing the flaps and the front pocket panel.